The dying light of October painted Willowbrook in shades of rust and shadow, as 9-year-old Clara Bell pressed herself against the weathered stones at the town's edge. Her torn blue dress offered little protection against the Nebraska wind that swept across the territory with relentless fury. 3 days without food had left her weak and hollow-eyed, her small fingers clutching a smooth rock for what little warmth it could provide. From Murphy's saloon came the distant sound of laughter and piano music. But here at civilization's fringe, there was only silence and the approaching darkness that promised another night of terror. The coyotes had begun their evening hunt, yellow eyes gleaming as they caught the scent of her desperation. 50 yards away, concealed behind sagebrush, Tokala watched with the patience of a hunter. The 30-year-old Lakota warrior had been observing the child for hours, his weathered face marked by old battle scars and dark eyes that held depths of regret. Something about her solitude stirred memories he had tried to bury the death of Running Deer, a child who had perished alone, while Tokala hesitated, paralyzed by uncertainty and youth. The coyotes crept closer through the gathering dusk. Tokala's hand moved to his knife, and the predators retreated into shadow, but they would return with full darkness. The girl would not survive another night alone. Clara Bell had been born under what the folk of Willowbrook called an unlucky star. At 9 years old, she had already been blamed for disasters that would break grown men. The barn fire that destroyed their winter hay. The failed corn harvest during the worst drought in memory. Her mother's wasting sickness that had claimed Martha Bell just 2 weeks ago, leaving the family shattered and desperate for someone to blame. What made the situation particularly tragic was how her own family had turned against her. Samuel Bell, her father, had become a broken man since Martha's death. Where once he had been merely distant grief had transformed him into something bitter and dangerous. In his desperation to make sense of their misfortunes, he had embraced the town's superstitions about his youngest child. But it was Tom Bradley who had emerged as Clara's most vocal enemy. The general store owner had been keeping detailed records of the Bell family's mounting debts during Martha's illness, and each unpaid bill seemed to coincide with some new disaster. When Clara had visited his store to beg for credit just days before her mother's death, a shelf of canned goods had mysteriously collapsed, destroying valuable inventory. Bradley had been convinced ever since that the girl carried some malevolent influence. That child is a walking calamity. Bradley would tell anyone who would listen, his thin face flushed with righteous anger. Every family she's touched has suffered losses. The Hendersons lost livestock after she visited. The Morrisons' well went dry the day after she walked past their property. And look what happened to her own family: bankruptcy, sickness, death. Even more disturbing were the incidents Bradley claimed to have witnessed personally. Milk souring when Clara entered his store, bread molding overnight after she had touched the loaves, coins slipping through customers' fingers when she was nearby. Whether these events were real or imagined hardly mattered. Bradley's passionate conviction had infected much of the town. What Clara didn't know, what none of them suspected, was that her 24-year-old brother Michael had been watching these accusations with growing relief rather than indignation. Michael Bell had cultivated a reputation as the responsible son and the one who helped support the family, and contributed to the community through church attendance and volunteer work during harvest time. But behind his public facade lay a secret that would have destroyed him if discovered. For months, Michael had been systematically stealing small amounts from the family's meager savings to feed a gambling addiction that had grown from innocent poker games to desperate bets on horse races and prize fights. The debts had mounted beyond his ability to pay through honest means, and creditors were beginning to ask pointed questions about repayment schedules. On the surface, Michael appeared to be Clara's most steadfast defender within the family. When their father's accusations grew too harsh, Michael would intervene with gentle words of moderation. "Papa, she's just a child," he would say, placing a calming hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Maybe these things would have happened anyway. We don't know for certain that Clara is responsible." But these defenses were calculated performances designed to maintain his image as a caring brother, while secretly hoping the accusations would continue to divert attention from his own crimes. Each time the town's suspicions fell on Clara, Michael felt a guilty relief that his gambling debts and theft remained hidden. The barn fire had been the perfect example of Michael's duplicity. On the night it occurred, he had been in the barn himself, desperately searching through his father's hidden savings for money to pay off a particularly threatening creditor. In his panic to escape undetected when he heard Clara approaching with their father, Michael had knocked over a lantern, sending flames racing through the dry hay. He had watched from the house as the fire consumed their most valuable building, and when Clara became the target of accusations, he had made a show of defending her while secretly calculating how perfectly the disaster served his purposes. I don't understand how it could have happened. He had told the gathered neighbors the next morning, his voice heavy with apparent confusion and sorrow. Clara was helping Papa with the evening chores, just like always. She's always been so careful with the lanterns. But privately, Michael had been relieved beyond measure. The missing money from his father's savings would now be attributed to emergency expenses related to the fire. His theft would remain undetected, hidden within the larger financial catastrophe that had befallen the family. The truth was that Michael had been stealing for months, taking small amounts that he hoped wouldn't be noticed. But Martha Bell's illness had made her more observant rather than less. During her final weeks, she had begun keeping meticulous track of every penny, desperately trying to manage their dwindling resources. "I know there should be more money in the jar," she had whispered to Michael during one of her lucid moments. "I counted it yesterday, and now some is missing. I'm not confused, son. I know what I saw." Michael had managed to deflect her suspicions with gentle reassurances about her medical condition affecting her memory. But he knew it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the full extent of his theft. When Martha finally succumbed to her illness, Michael had felt grief for his mother's death, but also guilty relief that his secret would die with her. Now, with Clara being driven from town as a scapegoat for the family's misfortunes, Michael's position seemed secure. His sister's supposed hex would explain everything that had gone wrong, from the barn fire to their mother's death to their financial difficulties. He could continue his gambling with a clean slate, knowing that any future problems would likely be blamed on residual effects of Clara's malevolent influence. After Martha's funeral, Samuel Bell had finally succumbed to the town's pressure and his own desperate need to blame someone for his suffering. The combination of Tom Bradley's passionate accusations, Reverend Morrison's veiled sermons about marked souls, and his own grief-driven need for answers had pushed him beyond reason. 3 days ago, he had loaded his old Kentucky rifle with trembling hands and marched Clara to the town's edge, his weathered face carved from stone by loss and rage. "Don't come back," he had said, his voice breaking with the effort of casting out his own blood. "Don't ever return, or I'll shoot you where you stand." Michael had watched from their front porch, his face carefully arranged in an expression of sorrowful acceptance. To anyone observing, he appeared to be a devoted brother, torn between family loyalty and community safety. But inside, he felt only relief that the final obstacle to his freedom had been removed. Tokala knew about exile and the pain of being cast out by those who should offer protection. 3 months ago, his own people had rejected him for choosing compassion over vengeance. When his war chief Spotted Hawk had planned a raid on a settler family with young children, Tokala had thrown down his weapons in refusal to participate. "You think like a white man now," Spotted Hawk had declared. "You have forgotten our ancestors' blood. You are no longer Lakota." The other warriors had completed their raid, without him leaving Tokala to wander alone between 2 worlds that no longer wanted him. He had been drifting through the territory, avoiding both Indian villages and white settlements, when fate brought him to Willowbrook just as the town was driving out an innocent child. When he saw Clara Bell forsaken at civilization's edge, he saw an opportunity to redeem his failure with running deer. This time, he would not stand paralyzed while innocence suffered for the prejudices of others. The third night of Clara's exile brought Jake Morrison and Tom Bradley, their courage fortified by whiskey and righteous conviction. Morrison, the preacher's eldest son, had inherited his father's self-righteousness without his wisdom, while Bradley's resentment over unpaid bills had transformed into something approaching obsession. They found Clara behind Dr. Hartwell's house, rummaging through garbage in a desperate search for food scraps. Her small hands trembled as she examined a piece of moldy bread, but hunger had long since overcome disgust. There she is!" Bradley shouted, his thin face flushed with vindication. "Caught red-handed stealing from decent folks." "I wasn't stealing." Clara protested weakly, her voice barely audible. "I was just looking for something to eat." "Don't lie to us." Morrison drew his pistol with theatrical flourish. "Everyone knows what you are, girl. You're coming with us to Sheriff Murphy right now." From the darkness stepped Tokala, moving with predatory grace despite the slight limp from an old bullet wound. His appearance was striking even in moonlight, traditional buckskin clothing, long black hair braided with leather strips, and an aura of controlled violence that made both men step backward instinctively. "Let the child go," he commanded in English, his voice carrying absolute authority. Morrison swung his weapon toward the warrior, but his hand shook with sudden nervousness. "This isn't your concern, Indian. This girl brings misfortune wherever she goes. She is hungry and afraid." Tokala replied, taking a measured step closer. "You are grown men with guns threatening a child. Who carries the greater evil?" Bradley tightened his grip on Clara's arm, making her whimper. "We know you've been watching our town's savage, planning some kind of heathen mischief with this cursed girl." The confrontation stretched taut with tension. Morrison's gun wavered between Clara and Tokala, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Bradley looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how far they were from help. "Your Christ taught mercy to the helpless," Tokala said quietly. "Where is that teaching now, when it matters most?" Morrison's resolve cracked first under the weight of those penetrating eyes. "Come on, Tom," he muttered slowly, holstering his weapon. "Let the Indian have the cursed girl. They deserve each other." As their footsteps faded into darkness, Tokala knelt beside Clara, who was sobbing into her hands. "Why did you help me?" she whispered through her tears. "Because no child should face the darkness alone," he said simply. "And because mercy is often the only light we can offer in a world that chooses to believe in curses rather than seek the truth." Tokala led Clara northwest toward rocky outcroppings that would provide shelter and concealment. She stumbled frequently, her legs weak from days without proper nutrition, forcing them to stop every few hundred yards for rest. The warrior fashioned a walking stick from a sturdy branch and offered small pieces of dried meat from his pack, but her stomach could handle only tiny amounts. Mama used to say the prairie was God's testing ground for the faithful. Clara said softly as they walked through the moonlit landscape. She believed that if we were strong enough and pure enough, He would provide for our needs. "Your mother possessed wisdom," Tokala replied, adjusting his pace to match her shorter steps. "The earth does test us, but it also offers gifts to those patient enough to receive them and wise enough to recognize them." They had traveled less than 2 miles from town when disaster struck without warning. A rabid dog burst from a thicket of dried sagebrush foam dripping from its maw and eyes reflecting starlight with unnatural intensity. The animal was gaunt from drought and disease, its movements erratic and unpredictable, the unmistakable signs of the madness that frontier folk feared more than bullets or blizzards. Clara screamed as the creature lunged directly for her throat, its claws scrabbling for purchase on rocky ground. Tokala reacted with the lightning reflexes that had kept him alive through countless battles, stepping between them while grabbing a heavy stone in one fluid motion. The dog collided with his legs, with desperate force, sinking its teeth deep into his left thigh, just above an old bullet wound. Pain shot through him like liquid fire. but he brought the stone down hard on the animal's skull, crushing it with a wet crack that echoed across the empty prairie. Blood flowed freely through his buckskin leggings as he examined the puncture wounds. "Are you hurt?" he asked Clara, fighting to keep pain from his voice. She shook her head, staring in horror at the spreading stain. "It bit you." What if it was sick with a madness? Tokala knew the danger all too well. Rabies was invariably fatal once symptoms appeared, but there was one chance: immediate cauterization of the wound, to kill any disease before it could spread through his bloodstream. With steady hands, despite the agony, he built a small fire and heated his knife blade until it glowed red hot. "Turn away, little one," he instructed gently. "This will not be pleasant to witness." But Clara had seen her mother's slow death and her father's descent into madness. She would not abandon her protector in his moment of need. She held his water skin ready and watched with wide eyes as he pressed the glowing blade to his wound. The smell of burning flesh filled the night air. His jaw clenched until she feared his teeth might shatter, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. When it was finished, he slumped against a boulder, pale and exhausted from shock and blood loss. Clara used strips torn from her dress to bandage the wound with surprising skill. "Mama taught me about healing," she explained. "She said that hands meant for helping could never truly be cursed, no matter what others believed." "There is no evil in you, Clara Bell," Tokala said firmly. "Only strength waiting to be discovered, and wisdom beyond your years." They found shelter in wind-carved caves among the rocky outcroppings, where centuries of weather had created natural chambers that provided protection from the elements. Tokala built a small fire in a depression that would hide the light from any searchers, while Clara gathered dried grass to create bedding that would insulate them from the cold stone. Dark clouds were gathering on the western horizon, promising a violent storm that would bring both relief from the long drought and new dangers in the form of flash floods. The air crackled with electricity, making their skin tingle, and distant thunder rolled across the landscape like war drums. During the night, Clara's condition deteriorated dramatically. The combination of exposure, starvation, and constant terror had pushed her young body beyond its limits, and she developed a high fever that left her delirious and shaking. "Mama, don't let them burn me," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I didn't mean for the barn to catch fire. There was someone else there, someone running away, but nobody believed me." Even in her delirium, Clara's mind kept returning to details that had troubled her for months. She remembered seeing a figure fleeing from the barn just before the flames became visible. Remembered muddy footprints that couldn't be explained. Remembered her brother's strange behavior in the days following the fire. Tokala knew she needed medicine, specifically quinine, the bitter powder that frontier doctors used to treat various fevers. The only supply within 50 miles would be in Dr. Hartwell's office back in Willowbrook. "Please don't leave me alone," Clara whispered, her small hand clutching his shirt. "Everyone always leaves me in the end." "I will return before dawn," Tokala promised. "You have my word as a warrior." Moving with the stealth that had made him legendary among his people, Tokala approached Dr. Hartwell's house through the darkest part of the night. The medical office had a separate entrance for emergencies marked by a simple wooden sign. Using his knife tip, he worked the lock mechanism until it yielded with a soft click. Inside, shelves lined with bottles and jars contained the precious medicines that kept frontier communities alive. He located the quinine quickly, but as he prepared to leave, footsteps sounded on the stairs above. Matthew Hartwell, the doctor's 16-year-old son, had heard a sound and come to investigate. The boy had been having trouble sleeping since his father had begun talking about the strange incident surrounding Clara Bell, and any unusual noise set his nerves on edge. When Matthew saw the silhouette of an Indian warrior against the medicine cabinet, his training took over. He grabbed his father's rifle from behind the office door and aimed with hands that shook only slightly. Thief, Indian thief. he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Papa, help! There's a savage stealing our medicines." Tokala fled through the window as the first shot shattered glass beside his head. He hit the ground running despite his injured leg, zigzagging through the doctor's vegetable garden as Matthew frantically reloaded. The second shot went wide, splintering fence posts as Tokala dove behind a water trough. The commotion woke half the town, and voices began calling out in the darkness as lamps flickered to life in windows throughout Willowbrook. "The Indian's back. He's robbing Dr. Hartwell. Get Sheriff Murphy, form a posse. Don't let him escape with our medicines." Tokala melted into the darkness beyond the town's edge, but he knew Matthew had seen the direction of his flight. Their hiding place was no longer safe, and Clara was too sick to travel far in her current condition. The storm hit just as Tokala returned to their shelter, announcing itself with a tremendous crack of thunder that seemed to split the sky. Rain fell in torrents that turned the dry earth to treacherous mud within minutes, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, brilliant flashes. The quinine had broken Clara's fever enough to bring her back from the edge of delirium. But she remained weak and disoriented. As they prepared to move to a new hiding place before the townsmen could organize a search, she spotted something through the driving rain that made her gasp in recognition. "That's our barn," she said, pointing to a pile of charred timbers barely visible through the downpour. "What's left of it anyway?" They had unknowingly taken shelter near the ruins of the Bell family homestead, abandoned after the fire that had sealed Clara's fate in the minds of the superstitious townspeople. The barn was nothing but blackened beams and twisted metal, but the stone foundation remained intact, including a root cellar that had somehow survived the blaze. "We can shelter there until the storm passes." Tokala suggested, leading Clara toward the ruins through rain that felt like ice against their skin. The cellar was surprisingly dry and warm, its thick stone walls keeping out both wind and rain. Empty shelves lined the walls, and the faint smell of preserved vegetables still lingered despite months of abandonment. It had clearly been used for food storage before the fire changed everything. As they explored their refuge by the light of Tokala's small torch, Clara made a discovery that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family and her supposed guilt. Hidden behind a loose stone in the cellar wall, placed there with obvious care and secrecy, was a small metal box wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. Inside were 37 silver dollars, more money than Clara's family had possessed in years, and a silver locket that made her breath catch in her throat. The locket was engraved with the initials MB in ornate script, and when she opened it with trembling fingers, it revealed a photograph of her brother Michael, dressed in his finest clothes. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, staring at the evidence with growing confusion and horror. "Why would Michael's locket be hidden here with all this money? We never had silver dollars like these. Where could they have come from?" Tokala examined the bills carefully by torchlight, noting details that told their own story. Some bore scorch marks along the edges, where they had been exposed to intense heat, and the oiled cloth showed clear signs of fire damage. The metal box itself was slightly warped, as if it had survived flames that should have destroyed it. Clara studied the money more closely, and a terrible understanding began to dawn in her eyes. "These burn marks, they're from our barn fire. I can see where the flames touched the edges. But that means this money was here during the fire. This money was hidden here before the barn burned down." The implications struck them both like physical blows. The evidence was undeniable. Someone had hidden this money in the cellar before the fire, someone who had access to the barn and knew about the hidden space behind the loose stone. Michael started the fire. Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hid stolen money here first, then burned the barn to destroy the evidence when he thought it might be discovered." Now the suppressed memories came flooding back with painful clarity. She remembered her mother's growing concerns about missing household money during her final illness. She remembered Michael's frequent absences and evasive explanations. She remembered seeing muddy boots by the door on the night of the fire, when Michael claimed he had been in the house all evening. He let Papa throw me out. Clara said, her voice hollow with betrayal, deeper than anything she had ever experienced. He stood there and watched while Papa pointed that gun at me, knowing the whole time that I was innocent. He knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and he said nothing to save me. More pieces of the puzzle fell into place as Clara's mind raced through months of suppressed observations. I remember now. After the fire, I saw him washing his hands over and over, like he was trying to wash away more than just soot. And when Mama started asking about the missing money, he would get angry and change the subject. Tokala placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremors of shock and rage that ran through her small frame. Some people will sacrifice anyone to save themselves, even their own blood. But now, we have proof that cannot be denied. Clara's grief transformed before his eyes into something harder and more determined, a burning desire for justice and the iron will to survive long enough to claim it. But they both understood that she was now a mortal threat to Michael's freedom and reputation. If her brother discovered they had found his evidence, he would do anything to silence them permanently. Thunder crashed overhead with renewed violence, and in its echo, they heard the sound that chilled their blood, and the approach of multiple horses moving through the storm with grim purpose. Michael Bell, alerted by Matthew Hartwell's report of an Indian thief fleeing toward the old homestead, was coming to eliminate the only witnesses to his crime. But Michael was not alone. He had recruited Pete Carson and Dutch Kowalski, two of the most dangerous men in the territory. Carson was a former cavalry sergeant who had been dishonorably discharged for brutality against prisoners, while Kowalski had deserted from the army after killing a fellow soldier in a gambling dispute. Both men had reputations for violence and a complete lack of conscience when properly motivated. These were not the bumbling hired thugs that might have been expected from a desperate amateur. Michael had sought out genuine killer's men who would not hesitate to murder a child if the price was right. He had paid them $50 each, a fortune by frontier standards, and promised them an additional $50 when the job was completed. "You sure this Indian has your sister?" Carson asked as they rode through the storm rain, streaming from his hat brim. His voice carried the flat, emotionless tone of a man who had killed before and would kill again without remorse. "That savage kidnapped her from town." Michael replied, his voice perfectly modulated to convey brotherly concern mixed with righteous anger. "She's been troubled. Her whole life touched by some kind of influence that brings misfortune to everyone around her. The Indian probably plans to use her in some kind of ritual sacrifice. It was a complete fabrication. But Michael had learned to lie with conviction over months of concealing his gambling addiction and theft. Carson and Kowalski didn't particularly care about the details anyway. They were being paid to solve a problem with violence, and the specifics of family drama were irrelevant to their task. "What about witnesses?" Kowalski asked pragmatically. He was a thick-set man with scars on his knuckles and the cold eyes of a professional killer. "This is a small town. People talk. There won't be any witnesses," Michael assured him. "The storm will cover our approach, and when we're finished, it will look like the Indian tried to sacrifice my poor sister in some heathen ritual and was killed defending her when brave townsmen arrived to rescue her. You'll both be heroes." The truth was far simpler and more sinister than his hired killers could imagine. Michael had been living with growing desperation since his mother's death, knowing that it was only a matter of time before someone discovered his thefts. Clara's exile had bought him temporary safety, but her survival posed an ongoing threat to his carefully constructed lies. If Clara returned to town with stories about finding hidden money, people might start asking uncomfortable questions about where that money had come from. Even worse, if she mentioned seeing someone fleeing from the barn on the night of the fire. Investigators might begin connecting the dots between Michael's gambling debts and the family's missing savings. The approaching confrontation would determine whether Michael's secret died with his sister or whether his crimes would finally be exposed to the harsh light of justice. They found tracks leading to the burned homestead despite the rain confirming Michael's worst fears. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized how close Clara had come to discovering his secret. If she had found the evidence he thought had been destroyed in the fire, if she knew the truth about his crimes, there's light coming from the old root cellar. Carson observed, pointing toward the faint glow that flickered through the storm, like a beacon calling them forward. Someone's definitely down there. Probably performing some kind of savage ritual with my sister. Michael said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. We need to end this quickly before anyone else gets hurt. The final confrontation began as the three men dismounted and approached the cellar entrance with military precision. Carson and Kowalski were experienced in violence, and they moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who had killed before and expected to kill again. But their opponent was no ordinary adversary. Tokala had fought in battles against cavalry units, and enemy war parties had survived situations that would have claimed lesser warriors, and was now defending the life of an innocent child with the desperate strength that comes from absolute moral certainty. The plan was elegantly simple in its brutality: trap Clara and Tokala in the underground cellar, and eliminate them both, and then claim that the Indian had kidnapped the girl for ritual sacrifice and been killed when heroic townsmen arrived to rescue her. Come out with your hands where we can see them. Carson called into the cellar, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. We just want to talk and make sure the girl is safe. But Tokala had heard their approach through the storm, his warrior's instincts honed by years of warfare, alerting him to danger long before less experienced men would have noticed anything amiss. He had positioned himself between Clara and the entrance, his knife drawn, understanding that the cellar's single exit made it both a trap and a fortress, depending on who controlled the choke point. The child is innocent. He called back, knowing that negotiation was useless, but buying precious time to assess their situation and plan his response. I will come out alone if you promise she will be allowed to live and return safely to town. No deals with child-stealing savages. Michael's voice cut through the rain and wind, like a blade carrying an edge of hysteria that revealed more about his mental state than he intended. My sister has been contaminated by your heathen ways. She's beyond saving now, but we can't let her suffer any longer under your influence. The words struck Clara like physical blows, confirming what she had begun to suspect during their flight. Her brother wasn't here to rescue her from danger, but to silence her permanently before she could reveal the truth about his crimes. You found it, didn't you? Michael called down to them, his voice cracking with strain and barely controlled panic. You found what I hid in the cellar before the fire. You know the truth about everything now. Clara's hand tightened on the silver locket until her knuckles turned white, and she realized with crystalline clarity that her brother had just confessed to his crimes in front of witnesses. But witnesses were only useful if they survived to tell their story. The attack came without further warning or negotiation. Kowalski threw a burning torch into the cellar to force the occupants out into the open, while Carson positioned himself to cut down anyone who emerged from the smoke and flames. These were not amateur killers who could be reasoned with or intimidated. They were professionals who had done this kind of work before. But Tokala had fought cavalry soldiers and enemy warriors in battles where the stakes were life and death, and he was now protecting an innocent child with the desperate strength that comes from absolute moral conviction. He burst from the cellar like a fury made flesh, using Clara's torn shawl to shield his face from the flames and smoke that billowed around him. His first target was Carson, the more experienced and dangerous of the two hired killers. A heavy stone grabbed from the cellar floor and thrown with deadly accuracy caught the former sergeant in the center of his forehead before he could bring his rifle to bear. The impact produced a wet cracking sound that echoed through the storm, and Carson collapsed backward into the mud blood streaming from his scalp. But Carson was tougher than most men hardened by years of frontier violence. The blow that would have killed an ordinary person only stunned him temporarily, and he rolled aside just as Tokala's knife swept through the space where his throat had been a moment before. "Kill the Indian." Carson snarled through a mouthful of blood, struggling to regain his footing on the slippery ground. "Don't let him reach the horses." Kowalski opened fire with his pistol, the muzzle flash illuminating the scene in stark detail. The bullet went wide in the rain, and darkness striking a charred timber and sending splinters flying through the air like wooden shrapnel. But Kowalski was a veteran of countless fights, and he was already adjusting his aim for a second shot. Tokala closed the distance between them with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, his knife seeking vital organs with surgical precision. But Kowalski twisted aside at the last moment, and the blade that should have found his heart instead opened a deep gash along his ribs. The hired killer screamed in pain and rage, but managed to club Tokala across the skull with his pistol butt. The warrior staggered, his vision blurring from the impact, but years of combat had taught him to fight through pain and disorientation. He grappled with Kowalski in the mud, both men struggling for control of the gun, while rain turned the ground beneath them into a treacherous quagmire. Meanwhile, Carson had recovered enough to draw his own weapon, a long-barreled Colt that had served him through numerous battles. But as he lined up a shot at the struggling figures, Michael appeared at his shoulder, his face twisted with desperation and barely controlled hysteria. "Where's my sister?" Michael demanded. "I don't see Clara anywhere." The answer came in the form of a terrified scream from the direction of the flooded creek. During the chaos of the fight, Clara had attempted to escape through a gap in the cellar's stone foundation, but the storm-swollen waterway had cut off her retreat. She was trapped on a narrow strip of land between the raging torrent and the violence unfolding behind her. "There." Carson pointed toward the creek with his gun barrel. "The girl's trying to get away." Michael's carefully constructed plan was falling apart before his eyes. If Clara escaped and made it back to town with her story about finding hidden money, his secret would be exposed and his life would be ruined. There was only one solution left, terrible in its simplicity. "I'll get her," Michael said, drawing his own pistol as he splashed into the rising water. "You two finish the Indian." But Clara had not spent 3 days surviving in the wilderness without learning something about self-preservation and quick thinking. As her brother waded toward her through the flood, she grabbed a broken fence post that was floating in the current and brandished it like a club. "Stay away from me, Michael," she screamed, her young voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "I know what you did. I know about the money you stole and the fire you started." Michael's face twisted with an expression of rage and desperation that Clara had never seen before, transforming her brother into something monstrous and unrecognizable. "You don't understand anything, you little fool," he snarled, lunging toward her through the knee-deep water. "You never understood what it was like to carry the weight of this family's expectations." The current was incredibly strong, fed by hours of torrential rain, and both siblings struggled to maintain their footing on the slippery creek bottom. Debris swept past them, branches, pieces of broken furniture, and even the carcass of a drowned animal, creating additional hazards in the already dangerous situation. "I had debts." Michael screamed, his words coming in broken fragments as he fought against the current and his own hysteria. "Gambling debts that would have destroyed me. I had to take that money from Papa's savings. I had no choice." Clara swung the fence post with all her strength, catching her brother across the shoulder and making him stumble backward into deeper water. "You had choices," she screamed back, tears streaming down her face. "You could have told the truth. You could have asked for help. Instead, you let them blame me for everything." The philosophical debate might have continued, but the practical realities of their situation intervened. The creek bank was beginning to collapse under the weight of rain-saturated earth, and chunks of mud and stone were sliding into the water with increasing frequency. Back at the cellar, Tokala had managed to wrench Kowalski's pistol away from him, but at the cost of a severe knife wound across his left forearm. Blood flowed freely from the gash, weakening him and making it difficult to maintain his grip on weapons. Carson had recovered from the head blow and was advancing with his own gun drawn, looking for a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting his partner. "You're finished, Indian," Carson growled, wiping blood from his eyes as he took careful aim. "You should have minded your own business and stayed away from white folks' troubles." But Tokala had one advantage that his opponents lacked, and he was fighting for something greater than money or personal survival. The knowledge that an innocent child's life hung in the balance gave him strength that transcended his physical limitations. Rolling behind the dubious cover of a fallen timber, Tokala gathered his remaining strength for what he knew would be his final gambit. If he could eliminate both hired killers quickly enough, he might still be able to save Clara from whatever fate her brother had planned for her. The warrior's next move was born from desperation and tactical brilliance in equal measure. Using Kowalski's own pistol, he fired 2 quick shots, not at his enemies, but at the weakened creek bank directly above where Carson was standing. The bullet struck the rain-soaked earth with perfect precision, triggering a small landslide that buried the hired killer under several tons of mud and stone. Kowalski, seeing his partner disappear beneath the avalanche, lost his nerve entirely. "This wasn't part of the deal," he screamed, clutching his wounded ribs as he backed away from the destruction. Nobody said anything about fighting devils in a thunderstorm, but before he could flee entirely, Tokala was upon him with the silent ferocity of a hunting wolf. The knife that had missed vital organs in their earlier struggle found its mark this time, sliding between ribs to pierce Kowalski's heart with surgical precision. The hired killer collapsed without another word, his blood mixing with rainwater to form crimson puddles in the mud. With his immediate enemies eliminated, Tokala turned his attention to the crisis unfolding at the creek. Through the driving rain, he could see Clara and Michael struggling in the rising water, their argument having escalated into a life-and-death battle for survival. Michael had managed to grab his sister around the waist and was attempting to force her head beneath the surface. But Clara fought back with the desperate strength of cornered prey. She bit his hand hard enough to draw blood, causing him to release her momentarily, then struck him across the face with the broken fence post. "Why won't you just die quietly?" Michael screamed, his voice breaking with exhaustion and hysteria. "Everything would have been perfect if you had just died in the wilderness like you were supposed to." But Clara had heard enough confessions and endured enough betrayal for one lifetime. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, she brought the metal evidence box, which she had somehow managed to keep with her throughout the ordeal, crashing down on her brother's skull with all the force she could muster. The impact was devastating. Michael's eyes rolled back in his head, and he released his grip on Clara entirely as consciousness fled. The current immediately seized his limp form, carrying him downstream toward the jagged rocks that had been waiting patiently for victims throughout the storm. Clara tried to grab him some vestige of familial loyalty, compelling her to attempt a rescue despite everything he had done. But the water was too powerful, and her own strength was nearly exhausted. She could only watch in horror as her brother disappeared into the churning darkness, his screams cut short by the roar of water over stone. Tokala reached the creek just as Clara collapsed on the muddy bank, overcome by exhaustion, exposure, and the emotional trauma of what she had been forced to do. The warrior gathered her in his arms, carrying her to higher ground as the flood continued to rise around them. "Is he?" Clara whispered, unable to finish the question. Tokala looked toward the rocks where Michael had vanished and nodded grimly. "The creek has claimed him. Justice has been served, though not in the way any of us would have chosen." Clara began to weep, then not just for her brother's death, but for the destruction of everything she had believed about her family and herself. The truth was finally revealed, but the cost had been almost more than she could bear. When the storm finally exhausted itself near dawn, it left behind a landscape transformed by violence and revelation. Sheriff Murphy arrived with a search party just as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the dissipating clouds, drawn by reports of gunfire and screaming that had been heard even above the wind and rain. The scene that greeted them was one of devastation and vindication in equal measure. 2 hired killers lay dead in the mud, while the evidence of Michael Bell's crimes sat exposed in the ruined cellar for all to see. Clara's testimony, combined with the physical proof of the hidden money and locket, painted a clear picture of betrayal and attempted murder that no jury would question. "Dear Lord," Sheriff Murphy breathed, taking in the destruction and the small girl who had somehow survived it all. "What happened here, child?" Clara held up the silver locket with hands that no longer trembled, her blue eyes clear and determined, despite everything she had endured. "My brother Michael started the barn fire to hide money he stole from our family," she said in a voice that carried far more authority than her 9 years should have possessed. "This locket proves it. His initials are engraved inside, and he hid it with the stolen money before burning the barn to destroy the evidence." She explained how Michael had tried to kill her to keep his secret safe, how Tokala had saved her life at the cost of his own health, and how her brother had met his end in the flood during their final struggle. Every word was precise and logical, delivered with the composure of someone who had faced the worst that human nature could offer and had emerged victorious through courage and truth. The revelation sent shockwaves through Willowbrook that lasted for months. Tom Bradley, who had been Clara's most vocal accuser, was found to have been accepting bribes from Michael to overlook certain irregularities in the Bell family's credit arrangements. His store was boycotted by outraged citizens, and he eventually left town in disgrace. Reverend Morrison used Clara's vindication as the centerpiece of a sermon series about the dangers of superstition and the importance of seeking truth rather than convenient scapegoats. His congregation, shamed by their treatment of an innocent child, contributed generously to a fund established for Clara's education and care. Dr. Hartwell worked tirelessly to save Tokala's life, treating his wounds with every medicine at his disposal, and fighting the infections that threatened to claim him despite his warrior's constitution. The entire town seemed to hold its breath during those critical days, waiting to learn if the Indian who had risked everything to protect one of their own would survive his heroism. Clara never left Tokala's side during his recovery, reading to him from books borrowed from the doctor's personal library and learning basic medical techniques that fascinated her quick mind. She had discovered an appetite for learning that her circumstances had never allowed her to explore fully. "The human body is like a complex machine," she observed to Dr. Hartwell as she watched him clean and dress Tokala's wounds. "All these different parts working together to keep us alive. How do you learn to repair them when they break down?" "Years of study practice and learning from every patient," the doctor replied, impressed by her intelligent questions and gentle touch with the wounded warrior. "Would you be interested in learning some basic medical skills? You seem to have a natural aptitude for healing." Clara's face lit with the first genuine enthusiasm she had shown in months. "Could you really teach me? I want to help people get better instead of just watching them suffer and die." When Tokala was finally strong enough for extended conversation, Clara was there with endless questions about Lakota culture, hunting techniques, and survival skills. Despite his weakness, the warrior found himself smiling at her insatiable curiosity and quick comprehension. "Now, will you teach me to track animals and read the signs of the wilderness?" she asked, settling beside his bed with yet another borrowed book. "And will you let me teach you to read these stories more easily? Dr. Hartwell says you understand English well. But there are so many wonderful books you could enjoy if reading came more naturally. I would be honored to share what I know of the old ways." Tokala replied, his weathered face creasing in the first genuine smile he had worn in years. And I would be grateful to learn from your quick mind and generous heart. The legal aftermath of the incident was surprisingly straightforward. Sheriff Murphy had arranged for all charges against Tokala to be dropped, and the territorial governor issued an official commendation for his heroism in protecting an innocent child from violence. But the warrior cared little for such recognition. What mattered was the trust and affection shining in Clara's eyes, and the knowledge that he had finally found redemption for his failure with running deer. 3 weeks after the storm, Tokala was strong enough to walk unassisted, though he would carry the scars of that night for the rest of his life. His leg had healed with a permanent limp, and his right arm would never regain full strength. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was Clara. The girl had been officially cleared of all accusations and welcomed back into the community with open arms and generous offers of support. Several families had extended invitations for her to live with them, including the Hartwells, and even Reverend Morrison, who seemed desperate to atone for his earlier treatment of her through acts of kindness and charity. But Clara had made her choice with the certainty that comes from having faced the ultimate test of character and emerged stronger for the experience. "I want to stay with you," she told Tokala when he was finally well enough for serious planning about their future. "You saved my life when everyone else was ready to let me die. You're the only person who never believed the lies about me being cursed." Tokala looked into her face and saw not the frightened, broken child he had first encountered at the edge of town, but a young person of remarkable resilience and intelligence who had survived the worst that human nature could inflict. The trauma had marked her certainly, but it had also revealed the true strength of her character. "The path I choose to walk is not an easy one," he warned gently, his voice still weak from his ordeal, but carrying the weight of honest concern. "There will be hardships and people who don't understand the bond between us. I am neither fully white nor fully accepted by my own people anymore, and you would share that isolation. I've already faced the worst that people can do to someone they don't understand." Clara replied with wisdom that seemed far beyond her 9 years. "Besides, someone needs to look after you. You're getting older, and you're absolutely terrible at taking care of yourself when you're wounded." Dr. Hartwell provided them with medical supplies, educational books, and a sturdy wagon for their journey west, where Tokala knew of peaceful valleys that would welcome them both without asking uncomfortable questions about their past. Clara had proven remarkably adaptable during their shared trials, learning to hunt small game and identify edible plants with skills that would serve them well in whatever wilderness they chose to call home. The townspeople of Willowbrook contributed what they could to help the unlikely pair start their new life together. Mrs. Henderson provided warm clothing and preserved foods, tearfully apologizing for her earlier treatment of Clara. Sheriff Murphy gave them a rifle and ammunition for hunting and protection. Even some of Michael's former gambling associates, shamed by the revelation of his crimes, contributed money to their traveling fund as they prepared to leave Willowbrook forever. Clara took one final look at the town that had nearly caused her death through superstition and misplaced blame. She felt no hatred for the people who had shunned her, only a deep sadness for the kind of thinking that could turn neighbors into enemies over imaginary threats and supposed curses. "Do you think they'll remember what happened here?" she asked Tokala as their wagon rolled slowly toward the western horizon, where new territories waited to be explored and new lives could be built from the ashes of old tragedies. The warrior considered her question with the gravity it deserved, watching the prairie grass bend in graceful waves before the morning breeze. "Some will remember and grow wiser from their shame and mistakes. Others will find new fears and superstitions to replace the old ones, because fear and blame are easier than understanding and compassion. But what they choose to remember is not our concern, only what we choose to do with the future we have earned through suffering and courage." Clara nodded thoughtfully, and settled back against the wagon's seat, pulling the warm blanket that Dr. Hartwell had given her around her shoulders. For the first time in her young life, she was traveling toward something better and more hopeful, rather than running away from something terrible and threatening. As their wagon rolled steadily west across the endless expanse of prairie, Clara reached over and took Tokala's scarred hand in her small, steady one. Together, they rode toward whatever adventures and challenges awaited them, no longer alone, no longer unwanted, no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. "I've been thinking," Clara said as the morning sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky, warming their faces and filling them with hope for the first time in months. "What if we started a school someday, when we find the right place to settle? You could teach children about tracking and survival and living in harmony with the natural world. And I could teach them reading and writing and basic medical skills. Think of all the good we could do together." Tokala smiled, feeling something he had thought lost forever, returning to his heart genuine hope for a future built on healing and education, rather than violence and revenge. "I think that sounds like the finest kind of justice against those who would have seen you dead living well and helping others to do the same through knowledge and compassion." Behind them, the wind scattered the last ashes of the burned homestead across the empty plain, carrying away the final traces of Michael Bell's crimes and the family that had chosen prejudice and superstition over love and truth. The story of the girl who was supposed to bring bad luck and the warrior who chose mercy over vengeance was drawing to its close. But their real story, their life together, was just beginning. In the growing warmth of the morning sun, Clara Bell smiled genuinely and freely for the first time since her mother's death, knowing that she had finally found her true place in the world. Not as a victim of ignorance and fear, but as a teacher and healer walking beside a friend who had shown her that family's not always about blood relations, but about the conscious choice to love, protect, and believe in one another against all odds. The supposed curse that had followed Clara Bell through her short life was finally broken. Not by magic or divine intervention, but through simple human acts of choosing compassion over cruelty, protection over abandonment, and truth over convenient lies. In the end, those choices had proven stronger than any superstition, more powerful than community prejudice, and more lasting than any curse born from ignorance, fear, and the human need to blame someone else for life's inevitable sufferings and disappointments. Their wagon creaked steadily westward through the morning wheels, cutting deep ruts in the prairie soil still soft from the previous night's rain. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills covered in buffalo grass that swayed like ocean waves in the persistent wind. It was a sight that had intimidated many settlers, but to Clara and Tokala, it represented freedom from the constraints and prejudices of settled communities. "Tell me about the place we're going," Clara said, adjusting her position on the wooden seat to face her companion. "This valley, you mentioned what makes it special." Tokala's eyes took on a distant quality as he recalled memories from his wandering days. "It lies 3 days' ride from here, nestled between red rock formations that rise like the walls of an ancient fortress. There is a stream that runs year-round, fed by springs that never fail even in the driest seasons. The soil is rich and game is plentiful. But most importantly, it is a place where different peoples have always come together in peace." He paused to guide their horse around a particularly rough patch of ground before continuing. "Traders have used it as a meeting place for generations. White men, Mexican vaqueros, various Indian tribes, even freed slaves heading north. There is an understanding there that a man's worth is measured by his actions, not by the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth." Clara's imagination painted vivid pictures as he spoke. "It sounds like paradise. But why hasn't it been settled permanently if it's so wonderful?" "Because paradise, as you call it, requires those who dwell there to be better than they might be elsewhere. Tokala replied with a slight smile. It demands tolerance, cooperation, and wisdom. Many people prefer the comfort of familiar prejudices to the challenge of building something truly new. As they traveled, Clara noticed how Tokala's posture gradually relaxed the farther they moved from Willowbrook. The tension that had marked his features during their ordeal began to fade, replaced by something approaching contentment. She realized that he too was escaping from a place where he had never truly belonged. "What will we do when we arrive?" she asked. "I mean, practically speaking. We'll need shelter and a way to support ourselves, and one challenge at a time, little scholar." Tokala interrupted gently. "First, we heal completely from our wounds, both the ones that show and the ones that don't. Then we learn about our new home and the people who share it with us. After that, we decide how we can contribute to the community we join." Clara nodded, satisfied with this practical approach. She had learned during their trials that surviving required focusing on immediate needs rather than becoming overwhelmed by long-term uncertainties. "Will you teach me more Lakota words while we travel? I want to understand your language properly." "How, little sister? Oyat means people or nation. Wakan means sacred or holy. Mitakuye Oyasin, we are all related." His pronunciation was careful and clear, giving her time to repeat each phrase until she had it right. They spent the morning practicing vocabulary and basic phrases with Clara, proving to be a quick and enthusiastic student. Her facility with languages impressed Tokala, who had learned English through necessity rather than natural aptitude. By midday, she could construct simple sentences and understand basic concepts in his native tongue. When they stopped to rest and water their horse at a small creek, Clara made an observation that had been troubling her. "Tokala, back in town, some people said terrible things about Indian ways and savage customs. But you're the most honorable person I've ever known. How can people believe such lies?" The warrior was quiet for a long moment, watching their horse drink from the clear stream. "Fear makes people believe many things that are not true," he said finally. "When someone is different from you, speaks a different language, worships in a different way, lives by different customs, it is easier to think of them as less than human rather than trying to understand them." He knelt beside the water and cupped his hands to drink before continuing. "My own people have been guilty of the same failing. We have called white men devils and monsters, refusing to see that some among them possess honor and wisdom. Fear and hatred are diseases that infect all peoples, Clara. The cure is to judge each person by their individual actions rather than by the group they belong to." Clara absorbed this wisdom as they resumed their journey. The afternoon passed pleasantly with Tokala, sharing stories of his youth, and Clara recounting happier memories of her mother's teachings. They had developed an easy rhythm of conversation, punctuated by comfortable silences like old friends who had known each other for years rather than days. As evening approached, they made camp in a grove of cottonwood trees beside another stream. Tokala taught Clara how to build a proper fire using dry grass as tinder and arranging the wood to ensure steady burning. She proved adept at following his instructions, though her small hands struggled with some of the heavier pieces of deadfall. In the old days, children learned these skills from the moment they could walk. Tokala explained as he watched her work. Survival depended on everyone in the tribe, contributing according to their abilities. There was no shame in being young or inexperienced, only in refusing to learn when teaching was offered. Clara successfully coaxed flames from her carefully arranged materials, then sat back on her heels with obvious pride. "Mama tried to teach me practical things, but Papa always said book learning was more important for a girl. He wanted me to become a teacher in a proper school someday. And perhaps you still will," Tokala said, settling beside the fire with his back against a tree trunk. "But now you will be a teacher who understands both books and the natural world, both civilized ways and wilderness skills. You will be able to reach children that others might not be able to help." They prepared a simple meal from their supplies, jerky hardtack and wild greens, that Tokala had gathered during their afternoon's travel. Clara found herself genuinely hungry for the first time in weeks, her appetite returning as her body began to recover from the sustained stress and privation of recent days. "I keep thinking about Michael," she said quietly as they ate. "I know what he did was terrible, and I know he tried to kill me. But part of me still misses the brother I thought I knew." Tokala nodded understandingly. It is natural to grieve for the person you believed him to be, even while knowing the truth about who he really was. Love given honestly does not disappear immediately just because it was not deserved. How do you stop loving someone who betrayed you so completely? Clara asked, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "You don't stop loving the good memories," Tokala replied gently. "You learn to separate the person you thought you knew from the person who actually existed. The Michael who taught you to read by the firelight was real in that moment, even if his motivations were not what you believed. You can treasure that memory while still acknowledging the truth about his character." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, finding comfort in his words. "Will it get easier?" "With time, yes. The pain will fade, though it may never disappear entirely. But you will grow stronger and wiser, and you will learn to trust your own judgment about people rather than accepting what others tell you to believe." They slept peacefully that night, wrapped in blankets Dr. Hartwell had provided with their fire, banked to burn slowly until morning. Clara dreamed of her mother for the first time since Martha's death, not the wasted, fevered woman of her final days, but the vibrant teacher who had filled their small cabin with stories and laughter. The second day of their journey brought them into more varied terrain with rocky outcroppings and scattered stands of pine trees breaking up the endless grassland. The air was cleaner and cooler, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers that bloomed in protected valleys. "We're getting closer," Tokala announced as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding country. "See those red cliffs on the horizon? Our destination lies in the valley beyond them." Clara shaded her eyes with her hand, studying the distant formations that rose like ancient monuments from the prairie floor. "It looks like a different world entirely. Are there really people living out there peacefully together? You will see for yourself soon enough," Tokala replied with a mysterious smile. "But first, we have one more test to face." As if summoned by his words, 3 riders appeared on a ridge to their north, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Even at a distance, their posture and the way they sat their horses suggested they were skilled warriors keeping watch over the territory ahead. "Friends of yours?" Clara asked, noting how Tokala's hand had moved instinctively toward his knife. "I hope so," he replied, bringing their wagon to a halt. "But it is better to be cautious until we know for certain." The riders approached at a steady trot, close enough now for Clara to see that they represented a remarkable diversity. The leader was clearly a Lakota warrior, his long hair decorated with feathers and his chest painted with traditional symbols. To his right rode a Mexican vaquero in leather chaps and a wide-brimmed hat, a rifle across his saddle horn. The third man appeared to be a former buffalo soldier, his dark skin weathered by years of frontier service, and his bearing unmistakably military. The Lakota warrior raised his hand in a gesture of greeting as they drew near, then spoke to Tokala in their native language too rapid for Clara to follow. Whatever he said caused Tokala's posture to relax noticeably. "Yao cousin," Tokala replied also in Lakota. "I bring a young friend who seeks sanctuary from the hatred of small minds." The warrior's gaze shifted to Clara, studying her with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. After a moment, he nodded approvingly and switched to English for her benefit. "I am called Standing Bear," he said, his accent marking him as someone who had learned English later in life, but spoke it well. "These are my trail companions, Diego Morales and Sergeant William Hayes, lately of the 10th Cavalry. We serve as informal peacekeepers." for the community you seek to join. Diego touched the brim of his hat politely. Señorita, he said with a slight bow from the saddle. Welcome to free country. Sergeant Hayes simply nodded, but his expression was kindly. Any friend of Tokala's is welcome among us, young miss. Word of your troubles in Willowbrook has already reached us through the trader networks. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness. What have you heard? That you were falsely accused and nearly killed by your own blood. Standing Bear replied bluntly. That Tokala risked his life to protect you when no one else would. That justice was served, though, at a terrible price. Stories travel fast on the frontier, Hayes added. Especially stories about courage standing against cowardice and truth conquering lies. The informal escort that formed around their wagon as they continued toward the valley felt like an honor guard rather than a security detail. Clara found herself relaxing as the three men shared stories of the community they were approaching, painting a picture of a place that seemed almost too good to be true. We have perhaps 50 permanent residents, Diego explained, plus traders and travelers who come and go with the seasons. There is a schoolhouse, though. We have been without a proper teacher since the last one moved on to California. There is a trading post, a blacksmith, even a doctor of sorts, an old army surgeon who decided he preferred healing to fighting. What do people do for living? Clara asked practically. Everything needful for survival. Standing Bear replied. We raise horses and cattle, grow crops in the fertile bottom land, hunt and fish trade with passing caravans. Some craft goods that are prized in distant markets. Everyone contributes according to their abilities and receives according to their needs. It sounded like the ideal community that social reformers back east were always writing about in newspapers and magazines. But Clara had learned to be skeptical of things that seemed too perfect. There must be conflict sometimes, she said, when people disagree about important matters. See, of course, Diego laughed. We are still human beings, not angels. But we have learned to talk through our differences rather than fight about them. When someone proves themselves unable to live peacefully with others, they are asked to leave. And they go? Clara asked skeptically. They go, Hayes confirmed grimly, one way or another. As they crested the final ridge before descending into the valley, Clara caught her first glimpse of what would become her new home. The settlement was larger than she had expected, with substantial buildings constructed from local stone and timber rather than the hasty lean-tos and sod houses common to newer communities. Gardens and corrals were laid out with obvious planning and care. Children played in the streets, children of various races and backgrounds, she noticed, all apparently accepted as equals. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of hammering suggested ongoing construction projects. It's beautiful. Clara breathed, genuinely impressed by what she saw. It is what people can build when they choose cooperation over conflict. Tokala replied. But remember, paradise must be maintained by those who dwell within it. It does not sustain itself. Their arrival created quite a stir, with people emerging from buildings and pausing in their activities to observe the newcomers. Clara felt herself the focus of many curious but not hostile gazes. Word of their coming had clearly preceded them, but people seemed more interested than suspicious. An elderly white woman with steel-gray hair and capable hands approached their wagon as it came to a stop in front of the trading post. Her dress was practical rather than fashionable, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to authority. You must be Clara, she said warmly, extending her hand to help the girl down from the wagon seat. I'm Margaret Whitman, and I run the school here, or try to when we have students old enough to sit still for lessons. Welcome to Haven Valley. The name fit perfectly, Clara thought, as she looked around at the bustling but peaceful community. This truly was a haven for those seeking refuge from the prejudices and conflicts of the outside world. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, Clara replied, accepting the offered hand gratefully. Tokala has told me wonderful stories about this place. All true, I hope. Margaret laughed. Though we're not perfect, we do try to judge people by their character rather than their appearance or background. I understand you've had some experience with the alternative. Other residents began to gather around, introducing themselves and offering assistance. Clara met the blacksmith, a freed slave named Moses, who had learned his trade in the army. She was introduced to the doctor, a gruff but kind German immigrant named Dr. Muller, who immediately insisted on examining both her and Tokala for lingering effects of their ordeal. There was Maria Santos, who ran the trading post with her husband and seemed to know the value and origin of every item that passed through the territory. There were the Fletcher twins, former mountain men who now raised horses and served as guides for travelers. There was even a Chinese man named Lin, who had apparently walked away from railroad construction work to establish a small but thriving laundry and repair business. The diversity was remarkable. But what struck Clara most forcibly was how naturally everyone seemed to interact. There were no obvious tensions or hierarchies based on race or background. People appeared to be valued for their skills and contributions rather than their origins. How is this possible? She whispered to Tokala as they were led toward a comfortable cabin that had been prepared for their use. How do so many different people manage to live together peacefully? Because they choose to, he replied simply. And because those who cannot make that choice are not permitted to remain. Their cabin was small but well built, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that would provide warmth during the winter months ahead. Someone had stocked it with basic supplies and furnishings, and wildflowers in a glass jar brightened the single window. This is temporary, Margaret explained as she showed them around. Until you decide where you'd like to build something more permanent. Or if you decide to move on to somewhere else entirely, no one is required to stay who doesn't want to. That evening, the community gathered for a welcome feast in their honor. Long tables were set up outdoors, and everyone contributed something to the meal. Clara tasted foods she had never encountered before. Spicy Mexican dishes, traditional Indian preparations, German sausages, and Chinese vegetables prepared in ways that revealed subtle and complex flavors. But more than the food, she was impressed by the conversation. People discussed everything from farming techniques to philosophical questions, and everyone's opinions seemed to be valued regardless of their educational background. Children participated as equals, their perspectives sought and considered seriously. I've never seen anything like this, Clara confided to Dr. Muller, who was seated beside her at the communal table. Where I came from, people stayed in their own groups and viewed outsiders with suspicion. Yeah, this is unfortunately common, the doctor replied in his heavily accented English. But here we have learned that diversity is strength, not weakness. When people of different backgrounds work together, they bring different skills and perspectives that benefit everyone. After the meal, Margaret approached Clara with a proposal that made her heart race with excitement. I understand from Tokala that you're interested in teaching. Would you consider helping me with the school? We have children of various ages and backgrounds, and I could use an assistant who understands what it's like to be different and excluded. I would love that more than anything, Clara replied eagerly. But I'm only 9 years old. Who would trust someone so young to teach their children? Age is less important than wisdom and compassion, Margaret replied. And you've clearly acquired both through your experiences. Besides, some of our students might relate better to someone closer to their own age than to adults who have forgotten what childhood feels like. As the evening wound down and people began to return to their homes, Clara found herself sitting by the dying fire with Tokala, watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. Is this real? She asked quietly. Or am I dreaming about the kind of place I always wished existed? It is real, Tokala assured her. But remember, it exists because people work to make it so. It could disappear if those who live here ever stopped choosing cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice. Clara nodded thoughtfully. Then we'll just have to make sure that never happens. The warrior smiled at her determination. I believe you will do exactly that, little teacher. You have learned the most important lesson of all, that evil triumphs only when good people choose to do nothing. 3 months later, Clara Bell stood before her first class as an assistant teacher facing a group of children who represented every background and culture present in Haven Valley. Some were shy, others boisterous, but all were eager to learn from the girl who had survived being falsely accused and had found her way to their sanctuary. Today we're going to learn about different kinds of families. She announced, her voice steady and confident despite her youth. Some families are related by blood, like brothers and sisters and parents. But other families are related by choice people who decide to love and protect each other, even though they're not born to the same parents. A hand shot up from a boy of about her own age. Like you and Mr. Tokala, exactly like me and Tokala. Clara replied with a warm smile. We chose to be family to each other, and that choice makes us just as much family as if we shared the same blood. Outside the schoolhouse window, she could see Tokala working with a group of older children, teaching them how to track animals and read the signs of weather and season. He had found his own calling as an instructor in wilderness skills and traditional knowledge, and his classes were as popular as her lessons in reading and writing. Dr. Moeller had been right. Diversity was indeed strength. The community's children were growing up with a breadth of knowledge and understanding that would serve them well, no matter where their lives might take them. They were learning not just academic subjects, but tolerance, cooperation, and the fundamental truth that people of different backgrounds could not only coexist, but thrive together. As Clara called her students to attention and began the day's lesson in arithmetic, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain of Michael's betrayal and death would always be with her, but it no longer dominated her thoughts. She had learned that families could be forged through choice as well as birth, that homes could be found in the most unexpected places, and that truth would ultimately triumph over even the most convincing lies. Most importantly, she discovered that the curse others had claimed to see in her was nothing more than their own fear reflected back at them. The real magic, the real blessing lay in the choice to love, rather than hate to include, rather than exclude to build, rather than destroy. The supposed misfortune that had followed Clara Bell through her childhood had been transformed into the greatest gift she could have received, the opportunity to help create a community where no child would ever again be blamed for accidents of fate or cast out because of others' superstitions. In the end, Clara Bell had not brought bad luck to anyone. Instead, she had brought hope, understanding, and the promise of a better future for all who were wise enough to embrace it.